Now, as regards tonight, I must say that I spent part of the time this afternoon wondering what I was going to say about Paul and how in introducing him. But I don't think that I have to say anything now because Paul is the first here tonight. He's the first speaker we ever had who has done all the introducing himself. Now, I learned something about you, Paul, I didn't really quite know before. I was just going to say that you had retired from the civil service, but now we know you have retired from the Department of Finance. The other thing, of course, that we knew about you was your great interest in Ballybrack stroke Killiney. And we knew that actually because one of your articles on the Martello Towers in Martello Tower in Killiney and Martello Tower number 7, I think it is, and Killiney Bay appeared in our journal a few years ago. What you may not know is that one very, very wet Saturday afternoon, a small group of us visited Martello Tower number 7. Now, the group was very small for the simple reason that there was a very big match on in Poland at the time, soccer. So soccer the society didn't compare for attractiveness with soccer. So the group was very small, but we had a wonderful afternoon led around the place by Neil O'Donoghue. And it was wonderful then to read afterwards about it in a little more detail in your article. I don't know that there's anything much else to say about you. You had another article last year, wasn't it? Our most recent journal about the meddler, Mr. Meddler, an undertaker in Dublin.
My
But
granddaughter.
I think I'll leave it at that and let Paul go ahead. And thank you very much for doing the warm-up act, Paul. It was wonderful. And thank you. So we're waiting for you now.
Maybe Bernadine, it's unique doing a warm-up act for myself. Anyway, will I go into screen sharing now, John?
Yes.
This would have been Vera Ball's last view of this earth had it been daylight and had she still been alive. But it was the dead of night, and she was very dead, bloodied and hacked to death by her son Edward. This is where Edward brought the body to dispose of it once and for all in the sea, hopefully to be swept away and never found. Or was that just a bonus? Had he any real thought-out plan, or was he just in a panic? Certainly, the murder itself was not part of a plan. T.G. Cahir were right to include it in their series Racht. Neil O'Donnell translates the term as pent-up, violent emotion, paroxysm, fit, outburst. And it was all of those things. So, a crime of passion then. The pent-up bit may go back as far as the split up between Edward's parents. The daddy was a prominent and successful doctor on the Dublin scene, and the mother came with wads of cash. While I have been warned never to make value judgments in these matters without having the full facts, and even then, my firm conviction is that the mother was not only unstable, but a bitch. The pent-up was kept alive by her constant denigration of her son, including in front of his friends. I gather from historian Pauline Pryor, through the T.G. Cahir programme, that matricides tend to live at home and be financially dependent on the mammy. That would fit. The daddy appeared not to want Edward around the place, and the mammy was fed up supporting and facilitating him and wanted him out. He was not earning his keep. In fact, he appears to have not been earning at all, but at the same time hanging around with a group of rich young folk. He had artistic pretensions and considered himself an actor. This view was not shared by others. Nevertheless, he hung around the Gate Theatre and occasionally got small parts. So, all in all, he appears to have been under a lot of pressure, both psychological and financial. Anyway, one day, February 1936, when he was 19 years of age, the dam burst and he hacked the mammy to death in her home at 23 St. Helens Road in Booterstown. The pent-up bit had developed a head of steam going back years, and the hacking was both violent and prolonged. The police soon came a-calling as the mammy's bloodied car was found abandoned near the end of Corbawn Lane in Shankill, near Bray. Initially, Edward said his mother had gone to stay with friends, and he didn't know where she was. The police were not convinced, and when they eventually broke into her locked bedroom, they found the scene as described by the pathologist below, and I'll come to that in just a moment. They also traced a suitcase that Edward had left with a friend for safekeeping. When it was opened, it contained blood-stained towels and such like. So Edward changed his story. The mammy was depressed, and she'd committed suicide by slitting her throat with a razor blade. Edward had disposed of the body to save the family name. Now, remember, at that time, suicide was both a crime and a mortal sin. The pathologist disposed of that one in big time. In summary, he said that there was not enough blood in the right places for a razor blade suicide, but there was blood in all the wrong places, all over the place, including droplets from squirts. Then they found the blood-stained hatchet with no fingerprints, and the game was up. Incidentally, after the trial, Edward expressed astonishment at there still being blood on the hatchet after him cleaning it off with boiling water. The detective explained to him that he should have used cold water for blood. The boiling water had just congealed traces of the blood on the hatchet. And hopefully he'll forgive me overdoing the tomato ketchup in that particular illustration. Now, Edward was tried for murder, with the whole country looking on. Initially, the legal team pleaded not guilty, but with the strength of the evidence against him beginning to dawn on them, they opted for a backup. If the jury were thinking of finding him guilty, they were pleading insanity. Now, if anyone was insane, it was the mammy. But Edward was sufficiently eccentric to give the plea some credibility, particularly when accompanied by medical testimony, no doubt facilitated by his father. In the end, he was found guilty but insane and locked up in Dundrum Criminal Lunatic Asylum for 14 years. When he was released, he had the money inherited from the mammy, and he spent the rest of his life touring the world on and off. Now, if he had been found just guilty and compos mentis, he would not have inherited the mammy's money. In fact, he would probably have not been around to think about it. Now, that's the basic chronology and the story. And we could just finish here, but there are many interesting aspects uh, which bear the retelling. Now, the question of sanity. Pauline Pryor, historian in the T.G. Carr programme, felt that his detention in Dundrum for 14 years suggested there was certainly something seriously wrong with him. And in the same programme, Dennis Kennedy, a former journalist with an interest in the story and a man sane enough to have headed up the Belfast EU office in his day, was quite clear that he thought Edward was not mad and should have been found guilty. Full stop. Now, I'm with Dennis on this one. When Edward had been packed off to school in England, no doubt to get him out of everybody's hair, he befriended a boy called Richard Cobb. Richard later became a well-known writer, though I've never heard of him. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. The point of introducing Richard is that he devoted a whole volume of his autobiography to his time with Edward, both in school and visiting Edward and his mother in Booterstown, and much later when he met Edward after his release from Dundrum. At the time of the trial, Richard, who was living in England, was afraid that the Irish police might think he had been Edward's accomplice in the murder, and he contrived to get a medical opinion that he was traumatized by what had happened and so could not travel to Dublin. And to be sure, he went and stayed in Belgium for a while, which country did not have an extradition treaty with Ireland at the time. All pretty exciting stuff, but the conclusions I draw from Richard's account are that, first of all, Edward was not mad. The mammy was a complete bitch, and there was a possibility that Edward was homosexual. In fact, a probability, I would think, at the end of the day, and that whether he realized it or not. And I should say that this last element arose not from Edward's friendship with Richard, who was not homosexual, but from an event which Richard experienced in Dublin while Edward was in Dundrum, and which I'll be looking at in more detail later. Now, Cobb's version of what happened in Corbawn Lane that night. And that's Edward telling Cobb 14 years later. When Ball arrived near the bottom of the lane, there was already a car parked there with its lights turned on. So he just had to wait until it went. Picking up the story from Cobb, and I'm quoting Cobb here. The wait had been agonizingly long, 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and the red blur had still not moved. In the end, unable to bear it any longer, he'd ended up by getting out of the car and stealthily approached the back of the car, blocking his way ahead. I can still hear his tone of indignation and outrage when, getting quite red in the face at the evocation of the scene, even after 14 years, he told me what his torch had revealed. Could you believe it, Richard? There they were, two people, a man and a woman in the back seat, copulating. Salute animals. He had gone back to his car, his clothes by now sopping wet, to resume his vigil, seething with rage and frustration. The couple were certainly having quite a night of it. Eventually, a bit after 3 in the morning, the red blur had started cautiously moving away and had finally disappeared. And that's the end of the quote. Now, that's the version through Cobb. So let's have a look at Edward's own statement made at the time. And this statement was made when he was claiming to have disposed of the body after his mother's suicide with the razor blade. Now, Edward was not a good driver, as will become apparent. This is reflected in his choice of route to Shankill. He turned left, exiting from St. Helens Road onto the Rock Road to avoid having to cross a lane of traffic if he turned right. You can see that there on the right-hand side at the start of the route. That meant he had to go up Aylesbury Road to Donnybrook and then out the Stillorgan Road to Shankill. When he got to Shankill, and you can see him coming in there in the top left, when he got to Shankill, the first point, which was basically the first point with a straight road access to a relatively deserted spot on the cliffs, he overshoots the turn and he has to head back towards town and Corbawn Lane on the right, which he then turns down. And I'm going to quote now from Edward's own statement. I returned then through Shankill and turned to the right down towards the sea. I did not expect a barrier, so when I met a barrier, I stopped. I got out and walked as far as the sea. I then came back to the car and waited a long time, about an hour at least, till another car, which was parked at the barrier, had gone away. After this car had gone, I got out and inspected the barrier and decided to try and push by on the right-hand side. As the car was so small, I thought it would get past. I then went back to the car and pushed it back a bit and then tried to drive it past the barrier, but it stuck. It would not go past. The wheels went round without stopping, and I just couldn't get it past. Then I took my mother out of the car and pulled her down the roadway leading to the sea. I don't remember how I was holding her when I was pulling her. I think I was holding her by the legs at one time and by the arms at another. I got her to the seashore and left her in the sea. I walked in about up to my ankles with her. At the time, I had locked my mother's room and taken the razor blade. I found a piece of newspaper, which was on the floor, and wrapped the blade in this piece of paper and put it in my pocket. And then, after leaving my mother's body in the sea, I dropped it, that's the razor blade, in too. I then came back to the car, and knowing I could not reverse, I left the door open and the sunshine roof, and this was to get the smell of blood out of the car. Then I walked to the main road. And that's the end of the quote. And when he got to the main road, he hitched a lift home. Now, I want to make a legal point while I'm here. A murder charge cannot be brought in the absence of a body or evidence that there has been a killing. In other words, that the person concerned is actually dead. In this case, there was no body. And despite some circumstantial evidence, the charge relied on Edward's own statement that he had seen his dead mother and disposed of the body. His defense counsel tried hard to have this statement withdrawn during the trial, but the court refused. Had he continued denying everything, while nobody would have believed him, it would have been difficult, if not impossible, to have brought a murder charge. And while I'm at it, in relation to the body, the Garda made some efforts to find the body. Chief Superintendent Reynolds from Bray reports that he put 7 objects, 3 crates and 4 oil barrels into the sea at the foreshore in Corbawn Lane. 3 were washed back to shore, and the remaining 4 vanished without trace, according to him. Now, there are also reports that there were boats and a helicopter and all sorts of stuff like that involved in an extensive search. But at the end of the day, Mrs. Ball's body was never found, and it hasn't been since. Now, with all these statements, I have to issue a warning here. We have to be careful of exaggeration in the reporting, the more so when Cobb is reporting many years later what Ball told him. So we're getting a bit of Chinese whispers here. We have to be careful matching up Cobb's report with Ball's statement to the police, because between his statement and Ball's report a lot later, there are inconsistencies. And when we add in the statements of the car drivers, which we'll come to in a minute, and even they are not internally consistent with one another, along with that of the man who gave Edward a lift back into town, we realize we have to be careful taking any of these statements at face value. Fortunately for us, the inconsistencies don't really matter much in this particular case, as nothing much hinges on them. So let's go back to Corbawn Lane and the cars. Now, remembering that Corbawn Lane was a lover's lane, we're going to hear directly from the car drivers. The first car was a large saloon. We've already heard that referred to. And then Edward's baby Austin came. That's the red in the number 2 in red there. And then there were two further baby Fords uh, later. Now, just so that you can exercise your imagination fully, this is a baby Austin of the time, and this is a baby Ford. So, the first person to come along was Harry Jacob, and he was in the large saloon, number one there, and he came from Ulverton Road. That's just down the way in Dalkey. Um, why he didn't go up the Burma Road, I don't know. Perhaps it wasn't there at that time. From this, it appears that he was the first car to arrive and the last to leave, except for Ball himself. And this puts him in the picture as one of the copulating couple which so shocked Edward. Now, a bit of text from Jacob's own statement. And the text reads, on the night of the 17th of February 1936, I drove the car down Corbawn Lane, Shankill that night. I had a lady friend with me. And that's the end of his text. I really love the term lady friend. The next car is the baby Austin, which is Ball's own car. And number three then is Edward Doyle's baby Ford. He came from Rathdown, the North Circular Road. He appears to have been the second other car to arrive, and he states that there were only two cars there at the time. He turned to face back up the lane, and he has no recollection of any further cars, probably too preoccupied. He has nothing much to report, really, but the bit of text that I've taken from his statement simply says that in my car, a baby Ford, I was with a lady friend, and that's the end of the text of his text. Now we look at Noel McAllister, who was the fourth car, and he came all the way from Dorset Street, and he arrived with a full carload, and he parked behind Ball's car. Now it was clearly not convenient to have two couples courting or whatever in the back of a baby Ford, so Noel's friend and his lady friend took off down the beach for a spell. And his text, taking one extract from it, on the night of Monday, the 17th of February 1936, I was driving a baby Ford car with three other passengers, one gentleman and two ladies. And that's the end of his text. Now, I leave it to the pedants in the audience, if there are any, to spot the linguistic inconsistency in that statement. When it came time to leave with full headlights on, Noel says he saw a man in the back seat of the car in front who appeared to have his arm around someone. Now, this statement was presumably the origin of the ghoulish public story that Edward was posing with his dead mother, attempting to give the impression that they were a courting couple. And Noel's text, he saw what he took to be a man. As I came nearer, he lifted his head and turned it towards me, apparently to see if my car was coming too near his. This man appeared to have his left arm around some person in the back of the car. That's the end of that bit of text. Now, closer inspection of Noel's statement shows that when further quizzed, he had to admit that he didn't see any woman, and he was drawing a conclusion purely on the basis of the way the man was sitting. And that part of his text reads, I judged the man had his arm around another person from the position he was in. I couldn't see the front of the Austin car. I couldn't see that he had his arm around anybody, as I couldn't see any figure. And that's the end of his text. So we leave the cars and we'll go on to consider something else, and that is the Edward's sexuality. When we were filming for the TG Carr program, the director unexpectedly asked me if I thought Edward was homosexual. I hadn't given it much thought up to then, but I have since. But what if he was? Why would this matter? Now, morally speaking, it's a matter of indifference to me, but it might have affected his life in ways that were relevant. If it was the case, it could have affected his relationship with his parents, for example. Some days before the murder, his mother discovered letters in his flat and brought them straight to his father. We don't know what was in those letters, and remember, he was sharing a flat. In those days, and right up to 1993, homosexuality was illegal in Ireland, and it could have contributed to a sense of isolation and pressure on Edward. Hilton Edwards and Micheál MacLiamore's partnership was known and tolerated, but they were very much an exception. And of course, it could have influenced how others dealt with them, whether they suspected or knew. So, are there any indications that we know of? So, let's go back to Corbawn Lane and the copulating animals. And I'm quoting Cobb here again. He would not hear of it. Copulation was disgusting in any case. And in this instance, it was holding him up. I had witnessed previous examples of my friend's moral indignation. He could be quite puritanical. The very notion of copulation disturbed him deeply. He tended to treat it as some sort of theoretical notion. I don't think he knew very much about it. He would not have been so indignant if he had. That's the end of the quote from Cobb. Of course, this might have just indicated an aversion to sex generally. Now, shortly after Ball's incarceration in the criminal lunatic asylum, Cobb came to Dublin to check out stuff and with a vague idea of possibly visiting Ball in Dundrum. He had arranged to meet Michael Feeney, who had been a warder in Mountjoy during Ball's brief incarceration there while awaiting trial. Feeney had given Cobb the impression that he had some information about Edward. And I'm going on to quote now from Cobb in some extensive quotes. So, according to Cobb, I met Feeney by arrangement outside the Bank of Ireland at 3 in the afternoon. In his letter, he had offered to do whatever he could to contribute to the enjoyment of my stay in Dublin. I realized with some dismay, on meeting him, that he had meant this in a very precise sense, for he was not alone. He introduced me to his companion, a handsome young man with fair curly hair, very bright eyes, rather vacant, tall, and with a beautiful figure, and holding himself so well that I thought there was something professional about his bearing, as though he had taken lessons in standing up. Later in the day, I came to the conclusion that he had also taken lessons in walking. Feeney said, "This is a very good friend of mine. His name is Brendan. He's only 18 and he's a Garda in the Dublin City Corps." I was already puzzled by his apparent need to provide me with this mini biography of his friend, as if I'd been about to employ him in some capacity or other. "You two should get on very well." At which point he walked off, disappearing into the crowd and leaving the two of us looking at one another in some bewilderment. That's the end of that quote. Now, Cobb didn't know what to make of this fella. He assumed that he had got to know Ball during his stay in Mountjoy and that Feeney had lined him up to convey some sort of information to him. In any event, they took the tram in the direction of Shankill and ended up walking along the cliffs not far from Corbawn Lane itself. There were long silences when finally, and I'm quoting Cobb here again, then he took the plunge. "Was I not then a fairy, too?" he asked. Michael had said that I was, and had suggested that we two might have a good time together, making his point only too clearly by adding that there were plenty of secluded spots a bit further on, hidden glades and green and yellow mossy floors where there was no risk of being disturbed. He'd been by this way many times before, and he knew all the nice spots. So there was nothing for it. I had to admit I must have sounded pretty foolish, for I spoke with genuine regret, as if I wished that my answer could have been different. I had to admit that I wasn't a fairy. Now, I hadn't heard that word used before, but it wasn't difficult to guess its meaning. Then, to make things better, as I thought, I qualified what I had just said by adding that I didn't think I was a fairy. This, of course, was a bad mistake, even though it had been designed only to soften the blow and to maintain a level of politeness in our exchanges. The young policeman did not see it that way, taking my remark as a sign of hesitation. Quick to seize the advantage, he pointed out that there was no time like the present, that it was only a matter of taking the first step, that I need not be shy, and that he would be very gentle. I was quite terrified by this new turn of events. I'd never had sex with anybody else, and did not feel at all inclined to starting on a twosome with an unknown Irishman. My Dublin trip had taken a most peculiar turn. Beanie had read me wrong. He had done his best for me according to his lights. He had wanted my stay in Dublin to be enjoyable. And knowing that my old friend in the city was now in a state asylum, and that I might be lonely, he had thoughtfully provided me with a handsome and consenting companion. I suppose I should have been grateful, but all I had felt was extreme embarrassment and immense relief at having got out unscathed from a very awkward situation. I had been aware of most of Edward's passionate affairs with younger boys in our house, that's in the school. Far from making a secret of them, he had wanted me to know all about them, from the start to the finish. For there was always a finish, and sometimes one both sudden and messy. I had put these down to the sort of temporary involvements that so often grow from the very conditions of life in an English public school, at least among the boarders. And that's the end of that quote. So Cobb himself seems to be coming to the conclusion that Ball's schoolboy infatuations had actually been manifestations of an underlying orientation. Cobb remarked that at the school, quote, I had belonged to one plane, his schoolboy infatuations to another. That's the end of that quote. So, although there is no direct evidence, I think it's possible, and even likely, that Edward was homosexual. So let's have a very quick look at the pathologist's report from the house. And I'll just touch on this. Now, he reported that there were blood pools and squirts everywhere in the mother's bedroom, but he was careful to point out that there was no blood on the ceiling. And I took that as the title of the talk. It will give you an idea of what the rest of the room was like, of course. Now, apart from the mother's bedroom, there was other blood around the place. There was blood where Edward had clearly chased the mother up the stairs, hacking at her. There was blood coming from him dragging the body back downstairs, and there was hair in tufts with no roots, which indicated clearly that they had been chopped. Now, let's go back to Corbawn Lane again and the question of the car. Now, we've seen that the car got stuck just short of the end of Corbawn Lane, and the following morning, the lane was crawling with cops. First to arrive were Sergeant Ryan and Garda Smith from the Shankill Garda station at Quinns Road, which you can see on the screen there. Incidentally, this old Garda station is now a private residence, but there is a spanking new station at Dorney Court, which is just off Corbawn Lane. In his witness statement, Garda Smith recounts how it took 6 policemen to move the car back from the barrier. The next requirement was to get the car back into town. Now, it had been thought originally that this was likely to call for a tow truck, as the key was missing and the car could not be started without it. Garda Walsh of Bray to the rescue. He recounted how he started the engine with a Peterson pipe cleaner. That really blew my mind. I'd heard of all kinds of electrical improvisations in my day, including the dangerous one of using silver paper from a cigarette packet to repair a fuse, but a pipe cleaner? All they were good for was making little stick men. This, I know, my father was a pipe smoker, and we had loads of these things in the house. But Having researched the lock and the key, and realizing that the pipe cleaner referred to was a tool and not a furry piece of wire, I got the message that the flat end would probably start or open anything in the times that were in it. And just in case you find all this confusing, this is an actual baby Austin key from the time. Now, the individual type keys that we have nowadays, I gather only came in around 1949. Let me refer to the television program. I forget how I first got involved in the program, but my first physical contact was with the program's director and researcher in the National Archives in Bishop Street. Nipa Sodhi and Shankill had come down from Belfast to go through the various depositions related to the case. Newspaper reports were not sufficient in themselves, particularly when it was possible to consult the original sources. This was a very laborious process, but it impressed on me how professionally the team were approaching the project. This impression was reinforced when I ended up filming with Nipa, the director, and Chris on camera and Michael on sound in Corbawn Lane, and later in the public library in Tala. These people were real professionals, perfectionists, and working very smoothly as a team. While I'm at it, I might as well pass out a few other compliments. I gathered in the course of my contacts with the team that TG Cahir insist on high standards, not just in the presentation of the final product, but in what lies behind it, including the quality of the research. And clearly, Paper Owl, the production company based in Belfast, were well up to the challenge. I'm really grateful to them all. I learned a lot in the process and I enjoyed the whole adventure immensely. Now, while we're on the subject of media, the thought occurred to me that this whole story would make a great novel. It had so many elements that you could play with, and being fiction, you could give them all the full blast. Imagine my disappointment when I learned from a talk by Dennis Kennedy that the novel had already been written and by a neighbour from up the road in Ballybrack, Terence DeVere White. Now, I have to thank Dennis and give him credit for a most interesting talk on Edward, which he gave to the Belfast Literary Society in 2008, entitled Dostoevsky in Dublin 4. One thing I learned from this talk was that Dostoevsky's novel Crime and Punishment was running as a play in the Gate during the November previous to the murder. This piece involves a young man planting a hatchet in an old lady's head, and this does seem a bit of a coincidence. Edward had been in the wings during the performance, and Terence DeVere White, in his fictional Edward, commented that he had read the book. Now, I quote here from Terence DeVere White's book. It had an extraordinary effect on him. Quote again, that book took me over so completely that I was never certain whether I was acting in my own life or as a character in the novel. And that's the end of the quote from Terence DeVere White. And of course, he's attributing thoughts to Edward here. Now, I have to admit, I read that book myself in my youth. And I have to say, I wasn't right in the head for a fair while afterwards. It really messes with you. And before we leave the world of books, Ray Kavanagh, in his biography of Mamie Cadden, a well-known backstreet abortionist of the time, reports that Mamie attempted to give Edward an alibi for the night in question, as she was convinced that it was the daddy what done it. Friends like that you do not need. Before I go to my peroration, I'd like to record the following quirk of fate. Now, I don't believe in karma and all that stuff, but I am sometimes severely challenged by events. Take this one. Long after the balls, a subsequent residence in number 23 St. Helens Road was moving out to get married. On the couple's way to check out a property in Greystones, they had a car crash in Shankill. While there, someone pointed out that there were some good properties going in the area, and to cut a long story short, they eventually moved into one of these in Corbawn Lane. Now, you may be wondering about me and Edward. What's my interest in Edward at the end of the day? Well, I first heard about the case when I was living in Ballybrack, and Corbawn Lane is just down the road, so to speak. I was also researching my local history at the time, and this was one that was too good to miss. But it was only when I started following up my family history that I realized that Edward and I had been born in the same house. He in 1916 and me in 1944. This was 40 Upper Fitzwilliam Street, then a nursing home run by the Mrs. Foodie, and now an English language school. The thought occurred to me that we might even have been born in the same bed. My wife reminded me that it was, after all, a nursing home, and there must have been hundreds of babies born there in the intervening almost 30 years. But there are only so many beds you can fit into a Georgian house, and there must be more favourable odds of this than winning the lotto. And just as an addendum, it was only recently I learned that my Uncle Pat played cricket with the Dundrum inmates way back then. So who knows? So we'd finish where we started, at the bottom of Corbawn Lane. And a warning. Be careful if you're ever walking the shore below the cliffs at Shankill. You never know what might fall on you. Before I finally finish up, just a few words of thanks. I'd like to thank the National Archives of Ireland for access to a wealth of material on the case, even if they're not entirely aware that I'm in possession of it. And Paper Owl Films in Belfast, I'd like to thank them too, and in particular their Nipa, the director, and Shan, the researcher, Chris on camera, and Michael on sound. A great crowd. I'd also like to thank Rini Kumsky, who lived in both 23 St. Helens Road and subsequently in Corbawn Lane, and her son Rob, who introduced me to her. I'd like to thank Felix Larkin for putting me onto Cobb's book, and you can see how important Cobb's book is in unraveling this story, despite exaggerations and so forth. I'd like to thank my cousin Gemma for her reference to her father's cricketing career, of which I was totally unaware until relatively recently. Thanks to James Scannell for inviting me to give this talk, and to John Fitzgerald for all the Zooming technology. Thank you.
I don't know whether it was in the T.G. Carr film or elsewhere. I read that Dorothy McArdle had involvement with him when he was in Dundrum and got lots of concessions for him. What can you tell us about that? Did it actually happen?
Dorothy McArdle did visit him, and it's not clear whether she visited him on her own behalf or on Dev's behalf. And she did get a load of concessions. He got a room of his own, and it does appear as a result he had quite an easy time, if such is possible, up in Dundrum. When it came to the cricket stuff, I put that in because I only found out about my uncle, and I was hoping that they would have been on opposing cricket teams. But looking at Edward and his sort of personality as it emerges, I suspect he was very much a loner, and I don't think he was a sporty guy. So the chances are against, much to my disappointment. But I don't know anything about Dorothy McArdle's visit. She came a few times. I don't know anything further about them as to what provoked them and all. So there's an avenue of research there, certainly.
Elizabeth, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. That was very interesting. I actually years ago read that book by Kenneth M. Deal, so I knew. But in the book by Kenneth M. Deal, I think he says that Edward wanted to go away to Egypt with the Gate Theatre.
Yeah.
And that was why he wanted the money, and his mother refused him. Is that what would tie to your research?
What possibly led to the blow up, or in the lead up to the blow up, the Gate Company were going off to Egypt on a tour, and Edward was sort of hanging around at the margins of them, basically. And but he considered himself, of course, an actor, but he all he got were small parts. But he decided anyway that he wants to go to Egypt. And like the mother's attitude was, this fella's good for nothing, and she certainly wasn't going to. He had an allowance from the father, I think it was, but he had an allowance, so he got some money. There was something to live on, and he asked the mother for 60 quid to go to Egypt, and she told him to get lost and forget about it. And I think that added to the friction when it finally broke out. Now, there's always debate about, again, what a crime of passion is. Do you have to have this belt of passion and chop the person's head off straight away, or can there be any interlude? Now, obviously, Edward, when he was losing it, went out to the shed, the garden shed, and retrieved the hatchet and came back in again, and then started hacking at the mother. So I think in a court that little adventure out to the shed might make your defence a little bit more difficult. But yeah.
Thank you.
Very good. Anybody else there? I'm just trying to see if you have your hand up. Anybody?
They keep moving around.
Seamus, I'm after you there. Yeah.
Paul, I was just wondering, that Ball family, were they in any way to family, one of them of whom was an MP for Dublin, and his son was the Dublin historian, Elrington Ball. They lived in the same part of the city. I was just wondering, any connection?
I don't know the I don't know the connection there. The speculation on her side is that she was a Wetherell from England, and that the daddy. All I know about the daddy was that he was an important doctor in the time. He had a place in Pembroke Road.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know the relationship otherwise.
You mentioned a crime of passion there. I thought, now I could be wrong, I'm not a legal person. I thought a crime of passion is only comes into play when there's an affair of the heart. Lovers are involved. I didn't think it came into play with mother and son. I could be wrong.
Well, I think a crime of passion is a crime where you just get overtaken with passion and you do the needful. I imagine. I mean, normally in fiction, crimes of passion are actually lovers' quarrels of one sort or another.
Yeah.
But I don't think legally.
And I think legal standing in Ireland. I know in France they do, in law, but I don't know whether there's any legal standing in Ireland. But I don't know. I'm not a legal person.
No.
They would usually arise where you're provoked into doing something.
Yeah.
To the point where you can't resist. You're just taken over by the impulse to commit the crime. And now I don't know whether going out for the hatchet would suggest a bit of forethought, shall we say, or preparation for it. But I think it probably would.
I think the issue is there's a Francis crime passion. I think the issue is premeditation, isn't it? Really.
Yeah.
And that's what you're saying, Paul. Is that going out to get the hatchet that indicates premeditation. Whereas if he had just hit her over the head with a book or something like that, it could have fallen into the other category.
I'm just thinking that it would weaken his defence that there was an interlude where, in theory, he could have composed himself, I suppose. But the crime of passion is purely. I mentioned the word crime of passion purely to link into the Racht series, because that's what Racht means. But it's irrelevant to the court case, because the court case basically was either he was guilty of murdering or not, and he was either insane or not. They were the only two issues effectively. So the crime of passion as such wouldn't have been part of the court considerations.
The crime of passion, if it had been pleaded and if it had succeeded, would probably have reduced it to manslaughter.
Well, that's
rather than being guilty but insane.
Yeah. So
could I just ask you, Paul, if do you know anything about how he came to be released from Dundrum? 14 years was a fairly long period to be in there, but you know, was there a review of the case or whatever?
No, I don't know the reasons. And before the lockdown, I had intended trying to get hold of the Dundrum archives. He was there for 14 years, but I mean, presumably in those 14 years, he might have been a bit difficult at times, but he was harmless. So I assume, I mean, it's at the Lieutenant Governor's discretion that you're locked up. So I assume somebody put in a plea to get him out, and they let him go.
I think that the year is interesting, 1954, because that's when De Valera came back into power.
Yeah, that's the point. That's the point.
I mean, officially the records in Dundrum are closed. I mean, well, I've been in there a couple of times, not as an inmate, but as an architect in departmental business. But I know the medical director showed us some of the old Victorian volumes that he had there, and I thought it was like beautifully bound. I'll take a photograph of them. He said, no, he said, you can't even photograph the cover. He said, everything here is confidential forever. Yeah. But I was talking to a former senior official of the National Archives subsequently, and she said that it's purely the notion in Dundrum that under the National Archives Act that no such stricture applies. But certainly under the present medical director, anyway, that's what he told me anyway. To see them. But I think as soon as you mentioned the De Valera connection, I mean, if you think if McArdle was there on behalf of De Valera was out of office during the interparty government in '54. Is it possible that De Valera was the one who actually could? I mean, you could have done it. The Taoiseach could have done it in those days.
Yeah. And I mean, De Valera might have known the daddy and stuff like that. You know, you wouldn't know.
Eugene Coyle, were you trying to get in there?
Yeah, just a very, very quick question. It deals with Richard Cobb. Do you know anything about his origins? Is he related to the Cobbs of Newbridge outside Donabate, do you think?
I've no idea.
It's an interesting possibility.
Yeah, well, he was based in England. I mean, it was in Shrewsbury, I think it was, that your man went to school, and he met Cobb and became Cobb's friend. And Cobb never came over to live in Ireland. As you can see, he was avoiding it. But he had come over to visit Ball during the school days, during the school holidays and that. And just on the mother's character, I was expecting somebody to give out to me for what I said about the mother. But there was an incident that the mother had split up with the father, and she had left in 1927, and she had left that house and gone out to Booterstown, but there was some stuff of hers in the house. And when your man was over on summer holidays with Edward, that's Cobb with Edward, she persuaded the pair of them to break in through the back garden and into the house and steal this stuff. I don't remember off the top of my head what it was, and steal this stuff. But they made a mess of it, and they got caught. And she denied anything to do with it. It was all this other fella's fault. So Cobb probably had it in for that reason. But there were other occasions when she visited Edward in the school, and she never stopped nagging at him, and in front of his friends, which really is a bit much. I see Tom Ferris seems to be trying to get back in again, if you can admit him.
Tom Ferris?
Yeah, there's a notice on my screen saying, that's probably because you made me co-host. Do you want to un-co-host me?
No, we're quite...
Or maybe I can let him in. I can let him in now. Let him in.
Well, he can let himself in, yeah.
Oh, he was in the waiting room for some reason, and it came up on my screen. He must have had problem with his connection and gone off.
Sorry about that, yeah.
Well, I've clicked on it, so he should be back.
Sorry, Paul, answer your question. The Cobbs of Donabate spell their name with an E at the end, so it's a different family.
Yeah. Well,
I do remember Richard Cobb's book when it was out. I think it might have been serialized on the Sunday Independent or something. It was a long ago. But I do remember there's a piece in it, and because you'll have read it recently, that when they were on the tram or the bus, this is that Cobb maintains that the murderer had the view, Mr. Edward Ball, that Ireland was a priest-ridden country, and he went round the bus. It's in the book somewhere. blessing people and all this type of thing. Did you remember that in the book?
I don't remember that, but it's actually a long time since a good while since I read the book. Yeah.
But that, I mean, when I saw that, I said, you know, this is a very odd individual. I mean, you could see, possibly having been in an English pub, I was in public school in England, that, and he was probably trying to impress Cobb, but he was very sophisticated, that all these people on the bus were peasants, you know, and he was going around blessing them, you know. That was a very odd thing to do, I would have thought.
It was, yeah, and of course his puritanical attitude would be fully in keeping with that. I think, yeah.
Okay, Rini.
I just wanted to actually make an interesting comment, I suppose, Paul, that prior to ending up living in 23 St. Helens Road, which I obviously had no say in at all because I was only a child. I was only 12 when we moved there, and I didn't even know at the time that it was the house where the murder had taken place. But my introduction to the murder had been that we lived with my grandmother just down the road from St. Helens Road in Williamstown. And when I was growing up there, she told the story of the murder as like local folklore, you know?
Yeah.
And without any internet, without any access to any books or anything, purely from her memory of, I presume, the newspapers at the time, she had said to us, oh, you know, the Ball murder took place up the road there in St. Helens Road, and Edward Ball, he wanted to go on a holiday with his friends, and his mother wouldn't give him the money, and he killed her with an axe. And we knew that as local kids, as I say, without any access to any official or formal information, you know. So I just found that interesting, that when you know, it was much later that I actually found an old book in Blackrock Library with famous murders that happened to include a short couple of pages on the murder of the Mrs. Ball in Helens Road. And I'd say I must have been about 16 when I actually found that book. And I was surprised to find that what was in the book, and from things that you had said, that what my grandmother had actually said back then was quite accurate, you know.
Oh yeah, and I mean you're part of the story now.
But I didn't know that at the time, you know. I mean, because when we moved to St. Helens Road, the first thing my brother and myself said was, isn't that the road where the murder took place? Which house was the murder in? But my parents very cleverly said, oh, it was in some house up the road.
Yeah.
Only later that we discovered, like 2 or 3 years later, we discovered we were actually living in the house.
Well, your parents didn't want you up all night, obviously.
Up all night anyway, once I found out.
Oh dear. Yeah.
Okay.
It must have been a brand new house at that stage, really, was it? When the Balls moved there, it must have been very new.
It wasn't, no, there had been another family lived there in between the Balls and us.
No, but the Balls, the first residents of the house.
Yeah.
I think they must have been, like, we moved in 1970.
Yeah, well, I looked up that, I can't remember it now, but I looked up that when that in Tom's directory when St. Helens Road houses started to appear, and it would have been just a few years before the murder, not very many.
Yeah.
In my recollection now. Yeah.
Yeah, it was like you know, a country house for the mother. I mean, when we lived there, it still had the bells for the servants and everything. You could press bells in the sitting room and the kitchen and that too, and they'd ring in the kitchen. So she obviously had servants.
Brian Murphy, were you trying?
Just going to mention, Polo, you know that I was a regular Sunday fisherman on the beach there at Shankill during my teens. And certainly the Ball murder was a matter of great storytelling as far as we were concerned as kids. But I was astonished to find out when I got older and read Cobb's book, that he was in the mental institution, because the general story to us as kids was, here was the man who killed his mammy and got away with it.
Well, he did in a sense get away with it because the mental institution doesn't seem to have been too hard on him. And I think it was 1987 when he died, and he was traveling the world on the mammy's money. Afterwards, now the mammy had loads of money, but there were two brothers. He had one brother, so he would have got half it. And he was traveling the world. And he was sending Cobb postcards from all sorts of places where he'd been, and Cobb would then meet him occasionally. Like he certainly wasn't underprivileged at the end of the day, you know.
Paul, did you say that Cobb moved to was it Belgium, a country that hadn't extradition with Ireland because he was afraid that he might be extradited?
Yeah, you see,
that sounds very suspicious to me for a person who's totally innocent.
No, I'll tell you. A few years earlier, there were other letters that the mother had found of Ball's, and Ball and Cobb had been corresponding. And one of the things in the letters was a plot to do away with the mother. And she was going to sue Cobb. And Cobb got a cert to say he was really and the case was dropped. But there was that in the background. So I think he might have felt that that would have been known to the father. And he might have felt that if those letters were still around and they'd been found, and here was a plot between himself and Edward to do the mother in, that it might have been a bit sort of prima facie evidence. So I think he was reasonable. He had a detective visit him, as far as I remember, and quiz him over in England. But I know I think his fear that he was possibly going to be tied into this thing was quite real, and he might have felt that the medical cert mightn't have been enough, and he took some time in Belgium while the thing was going on. No, I think he had a reasonable fear of being dragged into it.
Very good. Have we everybody? I hope I'm not missing anyone on one of the other pages. We all finished? I think so. Paul, thanks.
I'm going to gallery view there and see.
Bernadine, do you? Yeah.
Well, Paul was enthralling from start to finish. I don't think any of us just sat back and waited for the next bit. It was fascinating. And the amazing thing is that it sounded like something in a novel or in a whodunit, and yet it was real life, because we all know where St. Helens Road is, and a good idea where Corbawn Lane is, thanks to your geographics. But Paul...
Bernadine, I was thrilled because when those girls came down from Belfast, they contacted me, and I forget how the contact came about, but they went in to read all the depositions. In other words, the evidence from all the various people, Ball's statement and the car drivers and all this sort of stuff, and neighbors that heard nothing and all that. All those statements are there, and they started off copying them. I mean, writing copies, and they realized they were going to be there for a year. I mean, there's buckets of them. So they took out a camera and they photographed them all. And they gave me a copy of all the photographs. So I've actually been through all those. So it was great. It was an absolutely great source. And in thanking the National Archives, they don't know I had them, but I'm thanking them anyway. But that was a great source. And what appealed to me was, I mean, the story, the basic story of these things can be well known, but it's the little bits of human interest around it that you're not going to actually get in the paper. Now, you'll get some of the car owner, the car driver stuff in the papers, but a lot of the stuff you won't get. And I sort of fascinated by personalizing the thing, if you like, in that way. And Judge Deal's is I mean, he has a number of pages on the case, all of which I think, apart from one. Oh yeah, I'll tell you something else in a minute. But if you want to get the sort of the bones of the story, Judge Deal's book describing the case and the background is very good. It puts it in a very short thing. But he put down there correctly, I think, that there was about a 14-foot drop. I mean, when you go down Corbawn Lane, it sinks down away, and it actually goes under what used to be the railway bridge when the old coastal railway line before it was diverted inland. You go under that and you go out onto a sort of a platform. It's a formal platform now, concrete with railings and all, but it was just a level place at the time, and you could go down to the beach, but there was a drop of, according to him, about 14 feet. Now that got wound up in Cobb's retailing of balls thing to 30 or 40 feet. And if you notice the difference even in the stuff I read, Cobb has down 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hours. Now, if it was 3 hours with the car lights on, either the engine was running or the battery would have been flat, I think. But if you look at Bald's statement, it was an hour. So, like, there are all these little, but they're not. It's not really relevant, except that it just warns you to be careful about taking all the stuff literally at face value. You know. Anyway.
Paul, do you know the detail that I loved? The reference to washing out blood with cold water, not with hot water.
Oh yeah, the detective actually said to him, I think, if I remember rightly, or else it was someone said it to me, that any housewife would know that.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So obvious.
Or sorry, I should say, and these days house husbands as well.
House husbands, yes.
The National Archives not tonight. Maybe we could put the society's express the society's regret on the recent death of Gregory O'Connor, who many of us would have known in the National Archives.
Oh,
recently
really?
retired, who died suddenly just around Christmas time, you know.
Yes.
Oh, that's very sad. That's very sad, Seamus. Greg was great.
He was
first class, and he went out of his way to help people and everything. Yeah. He knew it inside out.
I think it was New Year's Eve, actually.
Oh dear. I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah.
Well, I think we'll call it a night, and are very grateful. Thanks to Paul for keeping us going.
Well, thanks,
no
Bernard.
mention of COVID or anything like that. It was fascinating, Paul, and thank you very, very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I mean, I enjoyed this.
We enjoyed it, Polo. If we were unmuted, we could clap.
Well, you can. They normally do. They normally do the visuals, I think. But you probably find your hands are off the screen somewhere if you're not used to doing it.
Thank you, Paul.
Now, I hope to see you all in 2 weeks' time. That's on the 24th of March. And on that evening, Declan Brady is going to speak to us. And Declan is going to speak on elections and local government in North Dublin during the lifetime of the Rural District Council, which was 1898 to 1925. So in the meantime, I hope you all keep well and that you join us again in 2 weeks' time. Thank you all very much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thanks.